Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of the members of our leadership team, which include former Congressman Mel Levine and former LA County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. Thank you and welcome back to tonight's special guest, Aaron David Miller, and of course, thanks and welcome to our wonderful moderator, Larry Mantle. Some of you missed the announcements and the emails that we had to postpone what was to have been a program last night with the New York Times' Nick Kristof. He was called to Africa on assignment to cover the war and famine at the Sudan-Chad border, and we will be rescheduling that program. Sorry that some of you weren't aware of that. I always put those kind of things in emails, so you might want to open and look at the emails each week, even if it's just a quick glance. Next week, we have two programs, once again, on Monday and on Wednesday. The Monday program, the very popular and amazing Rabbi Ed Feinstein, will be interviewing Giddy Greenstein, a very interesting man. Giddy was the youngest member of Israel's delegation to Camp David and was an active participant on the Oslo negotiating team. He has been a decades-long advocate for the two-state solution and is a popular nonprofit leader and political activist in Israel and in the States. He has just written a book called Inside about lessons we should learn from Oslo to help us today. By the way, Dennis Ross, who we've had on this program many times, has reviewed the book and said it is a must read. So that's Monday. Then on Wednesday, we will welcome the Bulwark's amazing Sarah Longwell and her Democratic counterpart, Simon Rosenberg. Simon is the only pollster or analyst who correctly predicted that there would be no red wave in 2022. Can't wait to hear what he has to say about 2024. That will be a serious launch to our final 6 weeks of programming before Election Day. So be sure to look at the program list on the email you'll get tonight and sign up for September's programs. You'll notice that we have a new format for our email. Let me know if you like it or not, if you find it more readable. Spent some energy on that, so I'd love to hear back from you. Reminder, all of our programs are available via podcast and via our YouTube channel or website. You don't have to watch live. You can watch after the fact. Links to all of our past programs are in every email we send or on our website, JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org. We encourage you to send your friends our emails, to forward. All you have to do is forward them, and people can register on their own and join our wonderful discussions. Now, to introduce and engage our guest tonight, please welcome my colleague, my friend, and partner in this America at a Crossroads enterprise. He's a Cal fan, he's a passionate baseball player and a baseball fan, popular lawyer, and last but certainly not least, former Congressman Mel Levine. Mel, the program's yours.
Yes, thank you very, very much. It's a really great pleasure for me to again introduce Aaron David Miller to our audience. I think this is his third time with us, and we are really fortunate that he's been willing and able to join us on these occasions. I've had the privilege of knowing and often working with Aaron. I've known him for over 50 years. During all of that time, Aaron has basically devoted his life to trying to achieve peace in the Middle East. It's not always a gratifying activity. Aaron had served in the State Department for 24 years, where he served 6 different secretaries of state as an advisor on Israel-Arab negotiations, participating in American efforts to broker agreements between Israel, Jordan, Syria, and the Palestinians. He subsequently served as president of Seeds of Peace from 2003 to 2006, when he joined the Woodrow Wilson Center. He's found the time in the midst of all of this to write 5 books. I don't think anyone has more expertise on the subject of Israel-Palestine, and I have, as do many, many people who have worked with him or watched his work, enormous respect for him and for the work that he has done over more than half a century. As Janice indicated, we are extremely fortunate again to have the wonderful Larry Mantle as our moderator. As this audience, I think, knows full well, Larry is the longtime host of Air Talk, NBR's really flagship talk show. He's been the host of it for now almost 40 years, starting in 1985. It's the longest running talk show in Southern California. He is much awarded. I will not detail the number of prominent awards he's received. I will note that he was twice awarded the Society of Professional Journalists Radio Journalist of the Year. And we greatly appreciate and love having Larry moderate. He always asks the best questions and helps the process to be as good as it always is while he's moderating. Larry, the floor is yours.
Mel, thank you very much. It's always good to be with you. I so appreciate your kind words. They really mean a lot to me. And Janice, thank you, and Zev as well. It's a pleasure to be back with you. And I appreciate that in addition to our Weekly in America Crossroads series, so many terrific speakers like Aaron David Miller have been presented as a part of Israel in Crisis. This is the 16th in this special series. And Janice and those who have assisted her with the feedback on all this, Janice has done an extraordinary job since the passing of David Lair to bring all of these great guests to our programs and making them fit with the schedules of people that aren't just here in the U.S., but are living in Israel and around the world. We're going to be talking with Aaron momentarily. I've had the pleasure of having him on Air Talk for decades now as a guest. I learned so much from him every time he's on the program. But I just want to remind you of some of the speakers that have been a part of this series since October 7th of last year. The former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, which I had the pleasure of interviewing him. We've had Middle East negotiators, Dennis Ross was just mentioned, scholars who've spent years gaining expertise on the region, and this evening continues in that vein. Aaron, welcome. It's so good to have another chance to talk with you and to learn from you over the course of this evening.
Larry, thanks so much. And thanks to Zev, to James. And to Mel, I have to say at 75, Mel, I look back on those years, particularly the 80s and 90s, with extraordinary fondness. Those years were really characterized by any number of individuals who I really believe, executive branch in Congress and even outside, who saw real opportunities and worked hard to try to expand them to pursue Arab-Israeli peace. And you were certainly one of them. A great affection and admiration for you, Mel. And thanks again for having me. I would only add that my wife, Lindsay, this is the third time I've been on this program now, and she's right in saying that a little bit of me goes a very long way. So I really, really appreciate the fact that you've had me back now for number 3.
Well, we always appreciate hearing what you have to say. And again, we learn so much. I also want to emphasize that particularly for this program, I really encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A. I may go even a little bit earlier to viewer questions because so many of you were so well read on this topic. I know how important this is to you, and you have really important questions, very sophisticated ones to ask. So I want to give as many of those viewer questions a chance to be heard over the course of this evening. And please feel free, along with your first name, to put the location which you're in. It's kind of nice to let Aaron and me know, just to have a sense of place of where these terrific questions are coming from. So Aaron, I like to often start with these with the very latest in the news. And we have the latest tragic news out of Gaza. Gazan officials claim at least 18 people were killed, including UN staff, in an Israeli airstrike at a shelter in central Gaza. This just occurred within the past 48 hours. This had previously been a school. The IDF claims this was a precision strike on terrorists who were inside the compound. And we get yet again competing accounts, typical after an Israeli strike that inflicts significant casualties. UN and World Health officials have continued their calls for ceasefires, claim the Geneva Convention is becoming increasingly irrelevant. And I just have to ask you first, as someone who's been at the center of this, who's made peace efforts your life's work for so long, how do you react to these events? One comes right after the other. So to what extent do these still affect you?
You know, it's funny because October 7, I was in Maine, woken by CNN in the morning, 3 a.m. They indicated that there was some strikes going on in Israel. They weren't sure what it was. And I basically said 3 a.m. I'm coming back to Washington Saturday morning. Can we talk about it then? I couldn't get back to sleep, and I called them back. And since October 7, I have to say, and I'll be as honest and clear as possible, in order to function, in order to try to bring an analytical frame and not turn a human tragedy, which is deeply affected Israeli and Palestinian people and will for years to come, I basically defaulted into the position of an analyst. And I realized this the other day, that I had more or less suppressed and subordinated the emotional component of my identification with the Israeli-Palestinian and the Arab-Israeli conflict to the benefit of trying to create a certain measure of detachment and objectivity. And I realized in the end that that's really not possible. I mean, we're all sum totals of our own experiences. And there is no objectivity here when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There's no gold standard. All you can do, I think, is admit to the prejudgments, the prejudices that you have, and set them aside in an effort to search, I think, for analytical objectivity and ultimately a more practical and pathway that would put Israelis and Palestinians on the road to a much better future. I just don't think, Larry, that the full impact of what has happened, the traumas that have beset both peoples, and the asymmetry of power, which I think since October 7, in which there literally were two split screens. The trauma to 1,200 Israeli civilians, the taking of hostages, the sexual predation, the mutilation, the serial raping, on one hand, and Israel's military campaign, which began October 26 and 27, which has resulted in an exponential rise of Palestinian casualties, eradication of whole families, a humanitarian catastrophe, the spread of disease, not to mention the spiritual dysfunction that is going to affect Palestinians in Gaza. If you're a 12-year-old in Gaza, or you're a 12-year-old in any of the Gaza envelope communities in Israel, this is a seminal event in your life. And trying to separate the emotion from the reality and the objectivity, I think, is a very, very difficult line to navigate.
Well, and from an analytical standpoint, how do we make sense of these competing accounts? You know, this incident that just occurred this week, and you hear these competing accounts from Gazan authorities. You hear how the IDF characterize it, or does that matter? It's catastrophic, terrible things are happening, lives are being lost. That's sort of beside the point. Or do we need to try and, in this moment, figure out what actually happened?
I think, it gets to the issue that any military commander in a situation is going to make with respect to prosecution of a war, which involves civilians, where in this case, Hamas embeds its military and political assets in and around and underneath civilian structures and populations. The military commander makes a judgment. International law may or may not be relevant in this particular situation. A military commander makes a judgment as to whether or not the military target that an Israeli precision-guided munition or a 2,000-pound bomb is trying to destroy. The issues of distinction, are they separating civilian and military targets, and proportionality, whether or not the strike was somehow equal to the numbers of civilians that that we're going to die. I don't think it's possible, frankly, to make these judgments to the satisfaction of both parties. My own sense, I come away with trying to hold, this is the best I can do, to hold in my head and in my heart the sufferings, the traumas, and the events of what has happened to both peoples from October 7 until today. And I worry greatly that the headlines here are grim, and the trend lines seem to be grim as well. Gaza Larry is going to be with us, I'm afraid, for much longer than anybody would have anticipated.
These 6 Israeli hostages who were recently killed by Hamas had been living in inhumane conditions even before they were killed. This calls into question how long the remaining hostages held by Hamas are going to be able to survive. It would seem time is of the essence given the conditions they're likely being held in, but a ceasefire doesn't look anywhere in the near term. What is a realistic hope for the survival of the remaining hostages?
252 were taken, 97 Israelis judged remain. Maybe 35 of those were either killed on October 7, their bodies taken to Gaza, the traitor, they died in captivity. Look, governing is about choosing. I'm not an Israeli. I'm not forced into a situation where I need to make a judgment on what is the right course for the government of Israel to take here. But governing is about choosing. And in my view, the issue here is time, and the lives, the well-being, the physical and spiritual well-being of these hostages is a diminishing asset. I suppose if I had to put myself in the place of an Israeli decision maker, hostages are not the only issue in Gaza, but they are, in my judgment, the most urgent issue. And I understand the need for the Israelis to prosecute a war that would make it impossible for Hamas as an organization and as an organized military force to repeat what happened on October 7. But I would also want to believe, that in addition to ensuring that the lives of those who died are not in vain, that the Israelis have a commitment to redeem the living. And it's the redemption of the living, it seems to me, which has integrated itself in Israeli political culture. The redemption of those on the battlefield, dead or alive, is a hugely important mission. And it has always been. Not to put too fine a point on it, the current Prime Minister of Israel in 2011 made an extraordinary exchange. 1,076 Palestinian prisoners, including Yahya Sinwar, ensconced somewhere tonight in a tunnel below Khan Yunis or Rafah, or maybe even in Sinai, surrounded by hostages. The Netanyahu government made a trade, 1,076 for one Israeli corporal, Gilad Shalit, who was taken in 2006 by Hamas. That, and we're being made the same judgment, the same asymmetrical trade. Again, the Israelis will make their own decisions, but the redemption of the living is critical.
Aaron, we saw after the 6 bodies of the hostages came back, we had wide-scale protests in Israel against the Netanyahu government, many of the family members of those still being held, demanding that there be a ceasefire and release of the hostages on terms other than the Israeli Prime Minister says he's willing to accept. What's your assessment of the Israeli populists and their view right now of whether to continue under the current terms of the conflict in Gaza versus reaching what is not going to be to the satisfaction of people, but might release the hostages? Where's the public stand?
When you put 500,000 people out into the streets, a demonstration that the Israelis are literally voting with their feet. And that notion is validated by public opinion polls, which demonstrate that overwhelming majorities of the Israeli public want to prioritize the hostage. At the same time, Israel is at war, threatened both in the north and continuing to wage a campaign against Hamas in the south. I don't think as impressed as we should be by the number 500,000. The only number, frankly, that really counts right now is the number 64. And that is the number of seats that the current government holds in this coalition. And I think it's critically important, I think, to understand this sort of asymmetry. You saw Israelis in 2023, 40 plus weeks in a row out in the streets demonstrating in an effort to fight and defend their image and conception of their country, and to preserve the independence and credibility of the Israeli Supreme Court against the current government's efforts to change that. I thought to myself, I can't imagine 42 weeks in a row of a proportionate number of Americans in the argued culture in which we live, out in the streets defending a relatively unified conception of what America, the kind of country that they want to live in. So again, I think, frankly, when you reduce it to its essence, governing is about choosing. And in my view, the overriding choice, the overriding priority of the current Israeli prime minister is to maintain the coalition. He's not to maintain the coalition. I mean, on trial for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust in a Jerusalem district court before 3 judges, 4 years and counting. He's due to testify in December. I think the political realities are clear. If he loses power, then the choices for him are not all that great. It's a conviction, and there is precedent. Ehud Olmert spent 1.5 years in jail, charged with only one of the counts that the current prime minister is charged with, or a plea bargain, which would end his political career. So again, I don't think this is a heretical judgment. I think, frankly, if you look at the last 11 months, the choices that have been made, the priorities have been set. Coalition maintenance, not pleasing the Biden administration, not pleasing the international community, not even redeeming the hostages. These may be important issues, but they are not the number one priority. And unfortunately, it's hard to change a political system like that, particularly during a time of war.
I want to come back to that, but I want to talk about potential for a 2-state solution, because here in the United States, this is the dominant view among American Jews, but also among, I think, the general population. A 2-state solution, despite the challenges that presents, is the best possible solution. I think most people hold for the region. But after the October 7th attack, Israelis are so enraged, so wounded, so distrustful of Palestinians after that attack and the horrors that it inflicted, that we don't seem to see that same sort of consensus. In fact, there's tremendous suspicion now of being able to have any agreement with Palestinians. What would possibly change that, Aaron?
What would possibly change that? It's been 20 plus years since the last serious effort to negotiate the core issues of this conflict were attempted at Camp David in July of 2000. Giddy Greenstein, who is coming to talk, by the way, bears the extraordinary distinction of actually saving the life of the Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Barak, who was choking. Giddy performed the Heimlich maneuver and relieved that distress, which is really, it's quite a remarkable story. The youngest member, the youngest human at Camp David. Look, let's be clear. I have two grown children who are in their 40s. I don't have the right to mortgage their future, let alone the future of young Israelis and Palestinians, by telling you now that I think it is a thought experiment. It's an idea tethered to a galaxy far, far away rather than the realities back here on planet Earth. But the only useful deployment, in my judgment, of the phrase river to the sea, the only useful deployment of that phrase is to describe the problem that exists between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. Approximately 15 million humans. And the core question is how to figure out a political accommodation that will satisfy Israelis and Palestinians. Separation through negotiation, in my judgment, however unlikely it is now and for the foreseeable future, is the only way to deal with the demographic, psychological, territorial, and even religious issues that have made the Israeli-Palestinian conflict the most intractable, almost intractable, in the international system. It's going to take an end to the Gaza war. It's going to take the prevention of a potential conflict in the north, which could trigger something the Middle East has never seen before, which is a multi-front regional war. It's going to take new leadership in Israel. It's going to take a different set of leaders among the Palestinian people. And it's going to take a degree of commitment from a third party. I still believe that our phone continues to ring as it rang for the almost 27 years I spent trying to do this. I still believe the United States has an important, critical role to play. But in the end, Larry, it's a question of leadership. It's a question of whether or not Israelis and Palestinians, because there's no way, I don't care if you invited the greatest negotiator in the history of American foreign policy and put that person to this task without leaders, without an Israeli and a Palestinian leader who are masters of their politics, not prisoners of their ideologies, masters of their politics, convinced that they are doing this, pursuing this excruciatingly difficult challenge, not because of external pressure, because they actually believe that it is in the best interests of their, not just of their own people, but they're prepared to carve out space in their own narrative for the other side's narrative. You need, you need a Mandela, and you need a de Klerk. You need a Begin or you need a Sadat. You need a Rabin or a King Hussein.
So you're saying that even an international coalition, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Qatar, the United States, that there's simply no way to exert enough pressure on the Palestinians and on Israel to come up with a peaceful solution? I mean, because you look between those countries, all the financial resources they bring to bear, all the pressure that they have, they can't do that.
All of the parties you identified will have to play a significant role in this enterprise. But the heart of the matter here is an Israeli and Palestinian leader prepared to risk not only their political fortunes, but as Sadat and Rabin found out of their lives. I watched Arafat and Barak at Camp David. I listened for 13 days. I mean, they sat in the same rooms. They only met 3 times. That Sadat and Begin sat. And I know what Arafat was thinking, because he said at least a half a dozen times, you will not have the opportunity to walk behind my coffin, which is standard practice in Arab funerals. I don't know what Barak was thinking, but you need leaders with courage and commitment. And frankly, let's be very clear. I worked for 27 years ascribing to 3 basic propositions. Number one, there was a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that both sides could accept. Number two, the only way it could be arrived at was through negotiation. And the third principle of my catechism was only the United States had the capacity, the will, the experience to help the parties achieve that. All 3 of these propositions right now, in my judgment, I have not given up on them. but I refuse to live under the same illusions as they were illusions when I was working. You need leaders on both sides who have a sense of urgency. And Larry, I look at the international community. It is divided, it is distracted, it is self-interested. In 11 months, let's just forget about Sudan, for example, or even Ukraine, or the Uyghurs, or what's happening in Myanmar. The international community, or prevention of genocide. Never again. I served on the U.S. Memorial Holocaust Museum after my mother passed away. I served out her two years. The term "never again" is compelling, and it's extremely meaningful. But the international community has never abided by it. Not in the Nazi Holocaust, not in Cambodia, not in Rwanda, not in Darfur, not in Sudan, not with the Uyghurs, not in Myanmar. So the Middle East is littered with the remains of great powers who believed wrongly they could impose their will on smaller ones. You need an Israeli and a Palestinian leader. We cannot get there without them.
And so, Aaron, let's take a look at where we are right now. And you have many progressives in the United States who are irate about the current administration, what they believe has given essentially free rein to Netanyahu to conduct the war in Gaza using American military and financial support, of course, from the United States. If you were advising the president right now, what would your advice be?
Right now, or way
Right
back
now.
11
Right
months?
now.
Look, the question I get the most is why hasn't in 11 months, why hasn't the Biden administration exerted significant costs or pressure that normal humans, for example, let's say you and me, Larry, would regard as significant or serious pressure? And my answer, I could have written the script from the beginning. My answer is the president's persona, his emotional identification and attachment, not to the Netanyahu government, but to the people of Israel, the idea of Israel and the security of Israel is deeply embedded on his emotional and political DNA. From the beginning of this conflict, the president could have conditioned or restricted U.S. military assistance to Israel. He did not do that. The president could have introduced his own UN Security Council resolution or voted for somebody else. He didn't do that. He could have abandoned the notion of a negotiation with Hamas and joined the international community in demanding the cessation of hostilities. He did not do that. And he could have joined 140 plus three other recent countries, the Spanish, the Irish, and the Norwegians, in unilaterally recognizing the Palestinians. He didn't do that. He didn't do it because of his persona and his own history with Israel. He didn't do it because of the domestic politics, while the uncommitted have fled the Biden administration. The reality in Washington is that this administration is not going to give the Republicans who have emerged, and I voted for Democrats and Republicans, and I worked for them. This is not a partisan comment. The Republican Party has emerged as the Israel can do no wrong party. The Democrats are deeply divided. Politics still influences in the next 60 days before one of the most consequential elections in modern American history. This administration is not going to pressure. I've made this case from the beginning, and I've been wedded to it as an analyst. Finally, the policy, persona, politics, and policy. The administration judged, and they were right, that the only way to begin de-escalating this war, the only way, was through a negotiated ceasefire, which required the agreement of Yahya Sinwar and Benjamin Netanyahu. For those three reasons combined, I think, to essentially reduce the leverage that this country might have expended and deployed on the Israeli government, basically to near zero.
Well, and so let's say hypothetically, Vice President Harris is elected, do you see much of a change, given that she doesn't necessarily have the same sort of emotional attachment, long-standing? She's obviously younger and doesn't have those years of that relationship. Yet she expressed, of course, tremendous support for Israel during this most recent debate. What do you foresee if she is elected president when it comes to U.S. influence on the Israeli government?
I've never met Kamala Harris. I'll be voting for her. I think there's the inner Kamala, a generation younger than Joe Biden. She's not going to describe herself as a Christian Zionist. She's not going to say what Joe Biden said. If there was no Israel, we'd have to create them. There's the inner Kamala, who I really do believe has lost most of her patience with the current Netanyahu government. I think she can convey a sense of empathy and balance with respect to Israeli-Palestinian suffering. And don't get me wrong here, the president is a deeply caring man. But just listening to Kamala Harris, I think she conveys that sense of empathy in a much more effective manner. Would she then, are we talking about a change in tone and attitude, or are we talking about a change in policy?
Yeah, and in real policy, when it comes down to it,
think,
rubber meets the
again,
road, do you think she'd change it?
Governing is about choosing, right? And she's going to have to set certain priorities. She's inheriting a world that, in my telling, is a combination of migraine headaches on one hand and root canal operations on the other. How to deal with China, what to do about a never-ending war in Ukraine, how to handle Iran's quest and its current status as a nuclear threshold state, what to do about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think she's going to be extremely careful with respect to, and let's be clear, she will, if she wins, she will be dealing with Benjamin Netanyahu, because the odds of new elections in Israel before mid-2025, and when they come, by the way, and they will come, it'll more likely be over the Israeli budget, which cannot pass. It has to pass by March, or an issue of the recruitment of ultra-Orthodox Jews, which is incredibly sensitive to the coalition. I think that the U.S.-Israeli relationship is in trouble. I think the three elements that have driven it, value affinity, a high degree of coincidence of interest, and a strong basis of domestic support, those are the three definite. That's what a U.S. ally is.
Yeah.
All those three elements are under stress. There's no question. But the U.S.-Israeli operating system that has kept the Biden administration from pressuring Israel, I suspect it'll still operate, at least in the first year of
Okay. Aaron, we have a number of terrific viewer questions. I'd like to get through as many as we can, so as quickly as we can without you oversimplifying. I know that's the challenge. These are complex questions. We have Ira in Riverdale, New York. All signs point to the present Israeli government ending once peace is achieved. As we approach the one-year anniversary of the Hamas slaughter of Israeli civilians, what role is the potential for the current government ending playing in peace being achieved? I'm sorry, that's Jeff in Pasadena. Ira has another question. Ira, I'll get to your question. So again, the second sense there's, we approach the one-year anniversary of the Hamas attack. What role is there potential for the current government playing peace role?
I mean, I think there's virtually no chance for the current Israeli government, is currently constituted, to engage in any kind of negotiation with a credible Palestinian partner, which will be required, and succeed. You're going to get a new Israeli government. It's an inconvenient reality, maybe, but Israel is a right of center country. You're going to end up with a prime minister, I think, that is very high on civility, very high in the independence of the Israeli Supreme Court, very high in trying to cooperate rather than fight the administration at every turn. But in the wake of October 7th, very withholding when it comes to a lot of risk readiness to engage in a negotiation that would lead quickly to two states. I think that's not cards.
Ira in Riverdale, New York, what are the implications of the recent vote in Jordan?
The king, Abdullah, has in the footsteps of his father, created a sort of phased program in order to deepen and expand political participation in Jordan. The elections were October 10 for at least the first tranche. I think there'll be a lot of support for Abdullah's program. But remember, the vast majority of the Jordanian public Palestinians, probably other than Egypt, Jordan has the most to lose with a Palestinian problem that continues to endure. But I think the future of the Hashemites, I think, is pretty secure.
Let's take another question. This is Diane and William and several other viewers have asked, is there anything that can be achieved as long as Netanyahu is prime minister?
Anything, yeah. You can figure out a way to get a ceasefire that would at least move through phase one, limited exchange of hostages for a 6 week ceasefire, and an exchange of Palestinian prisoners. You could create a situation where Israel and Hezbollah, with the U.S. assistance and deterrence, don't end up tripping into a major escalation, which could lead to a multi-front regional war. Beyond that, I think the key to Saudi normalization, the key to expanding relations with key Arab states, is going to be not just a soft landing for Gaza, but a set of Israeli commitments when it comes to the Palestinian Authority, and at least a serious bid to support a two-state solution. And I don't think this Israeli government is capable of.
Sherry asks, how can Israel be expected to limit civilian casualties when Hamas uses schools and hospitals to launch their rockets?
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? And I think that there'll be a state commission of inquiry at some point, although that depends on the concurrence of the current government, which is going to examine not just October 7, but the war effort itself. Is it possible to imagine that any Israeli prime minister confronted with October 7 wouldn't pursue or use the tactics that the IDF has used in order to save their own soldiers and operate in this complicated environment? American military, when faced with these situations, I've talked to several who had experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we were engaged in operations which killed thousands of innocent Afghans and Iraqis as well. That's a hindsight judgment, Larry, and I think that whether there'll be, how much accountability there'll be, I'm not sure at all.
Former Prime Minister Omar told us months ago that Hamas is depleted enough that it doesn't pose a threat to Israel at this point, and that a ceasefire in which the hostages are released is in Israel's best interest because of that threat isn't there. Even when I pressed him on, well, even with Hamas still technically able to be in charge, with there no other government, that the coalition government to be formed in place of that in Gaza. He said, essentially Hamas is not a threat at this point. Do you concur with that?
The Israeli Southern commander of Southern Forces yesterday basically said that Hamas is an organized military force, has been destroyed, its formal structure. But I think, the reality is that Hamas is going to survive, as an insurgency. And through intimidation and co-optation, it will be able to influence whatever post-conflict reality exists in Gaza. The real transgression, in my judgment, and again, my view, don't shoot me, with respect to the Israeli government, is not only the issue of how to prosecute a war in a civilian population and minimize. You can't end the numbers of innocents who were killed, but you certainly could find a way to minimize the exponential rise of Palestinian deaths, is the fact that military power is an instrument to achieve a set of achievable, sustainable political goals. And there's been no serious interaction and planning on the part of the current Israeli government to do that. Hamas is an idea, and this notion that you can't defeat an idea, I've heard this so many times. There's truth in it, but you can make the idea less relevant. That was the key, to make the idea of what Hamas offered less relevant. And the only way you can do that is by creating a security and an economic reality which would be more beneficial to the 2.3 million inhabitants of Gaza. And there's been no effort to do that. And that is directly tied to the unwillingness of the current prime minister to cause friction within his coalition.
Michael asks, could you speak about what the settlers are doing in the West Bank and how that affects the possibility of an agreement between the Israelis and Palestinians?
I mean, it's a hugely important question. And this government, over the last year, it'll be 2 years in December of this year, you have Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, each ideologues with impressive budgets and a lot of authority, who have been pursuing a willful and calculated effort to impose policies in the West Bank that will create a situation where that territory is annexed to Israel in everything but name. They are expanding the space for settlers to operate, including validating and legalizing illegal outposts. They are contracting the space for Palestinians through intimidation and forceful removal of entire communities, farming communities, from their land. And the government, again, for political reasons, I don't think this is Benjamin Netanyahu's government of choice by any means, is acquiescing and paying Ben-Gvir and Smotrich in the coin, in my judgment, of annexation. And I think what you've seen in the last several weeks, among the largest operations since the Second Intifada, is a response to a number of factors. Hamas is making inroads. Palestinian Authority is retreating. And Iran is taking advantage of the situation through the Jordanian border by infusing all kinds of weapons, including IEDs. And then you add settler provocations and the policies pursued by Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. It's a witch's brew, and it's narrowing the possibilities, to say the least, for any sort of quick progress toward two states.
I was going to ask you about Iran and why we haven't seen a robust response to the assassination of the leader in Tehran. And Helen asked, how can there even be peace in the Middle East if Iran doesn't accept Israel as a state and it's got all these proxies in the region? Then, what's the potential there?
Well, I mean, you look at the Arab-Israeli confrontation line in 1948 and look at the Arab-Israeli confrontation line in 2024. It's actually quite impressive. And since 1979, Iran has tried to do everything it possibly can to upset it. But you have an Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. You have an Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty. Pretty impressive. So, no, the region can move forward, but it's increasingly difficult now given the fact that Iran, through its proxies, and by the way, the Houthis are not a proxy, they have their own interests and their own logic in terms of what they want to do and how they want to make themselves to be a relevant player. Hezbollah, for sure, is a proxy, and of course, Hamas. Look, the Iranians don't know what to do. On April 13, 14, they launched 350 high-trajectory weapons. 99% of them didn't even enter Israeli airspace. But the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, attending the inauguration of the new Pezeshkian, the new Iranian president, to say it was a humiliation and an embarrassment, extraordinary. Not only the fact that he was murdered, but the way the Israelis apparently engineered this hit. It demonstrated that every Iranian leader is potentially vulnerable, but they don't know what to do. They do not want to respond in a way that is less than what they did April 13, 14. But on the other hand, under no circumstances do they want a response that essentially means a major confrontation with Israel, into which the United States would be drawn. So they delay. Hezbollah's calculations is much the same. They're much more vulnerable. Look, but it takes 12 minutes for a cruise missile to go from Iran to Israel. It takes 90 seconds for a high trajectory weapon launched by precision high trajectory weapon launched by Hezbollah to impact Israeli airspace.
Judy asks, do you favor a ceasefire even if an agreement between Netanyahu and Hamas can't be made? Do you think the U.S. should withhold 2,000-pound bombs and other offensive weapons like that to force a ceasefire?
I mean, I think they would certainly get Israel's attention if they suspended or conditioned U.S. military assistance. I don't think they will, in large part because of Iran and Hezbollah. We forget the Northern Front. The Northern Front, in a way, creates a buffer that further dilutes whether the administration is prepared to use its leverage against the Israelis. I might add, by the way, in terms of leverage, you have to ask yourself this question. I ask myself it all the time. When was the last time the United States used leverage, real leverage, against any of its friends, its partners, or its allies? By the way, we just restored Egypt's $320 million, which we had withheld because of Abdel Fattah Sisi's, the Egyptian president's human rights violations. And why do we do that? Because the Egyptians are playing an incredibly important role in trying to broker this agreement with Israel and then with Hamas. So we don't leverage our friends, our partners, and our allies. And if we don't leverage as a general proposition, why is any president going to want to get into this with the Israelis and the political implications of a serious break with an Israeli prime minister? I think you know the answer.
We have so many great questions and limited time. I'm just going to, my apologies for not getting to all of these because they're really good. David asks, since the hostages have witnessed torture and rape by Hamas, is there no incentive for Hamas to release them alive?
I would think with respect, the question is asking whether there is an incentive for Hamas.
Yeah, what wouldn't the incentive, I think David has, being to not allow them to leave Hamas custody alive?
Yes. And that was clearly the case with the 20 women who are currently being held.
Lawrence asks, do you think that the fact that most of the hostages are left-wing in their political leanings, I don't know anything about that personally, but that Lawrence says that, could that have any bearing on Netanyahu's lack of prioritization of saving the hostages? No, in fact, just the opposite. He'd like to blame the war on the internal divisions that the Israeli center-left and left created by opposing his government's efforts on judicial reform. No, that's, and not all the hostages, but many from the Gaza envelope communities were in fact center and center left. All right. Jerry asks, could the IDF use more non-lethal weapons, tear gas perhaps, to separate combatants from fighting forces?
You know, I think the answer basically is no. I really do believe the IDF may have gone to extreme lengths to try to minimize civilian casualties. But I really do believe that along with a clinical, rational effort to destroy Hamas's capacity as an organized military force, I don't think you could rule out, and I know I'm going to get a lot of letters and emails on this. I don't think you can rule out the issue of an avenging Israel.
Mark asks, Trump claims he could end the war in Gaza in an hour. Is there in any way, shape, and form that a president could in fact do that?
No president could do it, and certainly Donald Trump couldn't.
We have another question from a listener, and this comes actually from several. What sort of a government in Gaza would make sense whenever there is an end to the hostilities?
A government that had enough support from key Arab states and the international community to deal with the extraordinary physical destruction of an area roughly twice the size of the District of Columbia, with one of the highest population densities in the world. A government that was committed, not a government that was committed to the well-being and welfare of their citizens, not an extractive government, nepotistic, autocratic, and a government that essentially would have to find a way, because of geography is destiny here. There are two countries that border Gaza, Egypt and Israel. And while neither are informal states of occupation, Israeli military is present there clearly. Any Palestinian government is going to have to figure out a way to work very closely with both. It's a simple matter of geography, access, entrance, and exits. Critically important.
Does this argue for a multinational, something temporary, UN
Look, if you could,
protectorate?
Sure. If you could get an international force, either with a Security Council mandate or without one, that was committed as a transitional mechanism in Gaza, it'd be great. But the reality is no international force is going to enter a free fire zone. And Arab boots on the ground, UAE is perfectly prepared to contribute force, but not if Gaza first is going to be Gaza only.
All right.
The Arabs will want to see that their financial, their political, and the support of their boots on the ground in Gaza is accompanied by a political horizon that will ensure that their presence would actually lead to something that wouldn't simply be a wash, rinse, and repeat cycle of another Israel-Hamas confrontation.
We're up against the end of the hour, but I want to use a viewer question to sort of set up your final statement, Aaron, and briefly, please, sort of, where we might have some hope. Leonard in Novato, the Bay Area city, said, you were talking earlier about we need Nelson Mandela. We need, a great leader here, and leaders, frankly. Do you have any idea who those two leaders might be?
I mean, I'd insult your intelligence if I answered the question that I did. I don't. Greatness in leadership is a rare commodity. Forget greatness, just good leaders. Good in the sense that they know what they're doing. They're good at what they do. Good in the sense that they have moral compass. And good in the sense that they understand that a conflict ending agreement between Israelis and Palestinians is critically important. Look, if you're a supporter of Israel, 76 years after Israeli independence, neither the borders of the state of Israel nor the identity of the state of Israel are yet determined. 76 years after our independence, neither the borders of this republic nor the identity of this republic are determined. Those two questions for an Israeli leader, where Israel is, which is undefined by large numbers of Israelis, and what Israel is, Is it a Jewish state? Or a Jewish state for all of its citizens? What is it exactly? Those are the two questions that any Israeli leader are going to have to wrestle with in time. And I think it's a Herculean task. I wish I had an easy answer, Larry, but I don't. And I know
Aaron,
time's up.
I appreciate you being with us and talking through these incredibly complex and that aren't just logically difficult, that aren't just practically and subsequently difficult, but morally difficult as well, and racked with emotion in our responses to what we're seeing in the region. Thank you so much, Aaron David Miller. Always a pleasure to have you with us. We appreciate it.
Very great questions. It was great being here with you, and thanks again for having me.
Thank you. And I just want to echo what Aaron said about the great questions. As an audience, the questions we get for America to Crossroads and these Israel in Crisis programs, this being number 16, are truly, truly terrific. So thank you for those. It's what really makes these programs, along with the great guest speakers. We thank you for joining us. I do want to remind you to come back, though, and join us Monday night when it'll be Rabbi Edward Feinstein in conversation with Giddy Grinstein. We're going to be talking on number 17 of Israel in Crisis briefing about the very latest developments there. That's Monday at 5 o'clock Pacific time. I will be back with you on Wednesday of next week, September 18th, with Sarah Longwell and Simon Rosenberg. A closer look at the 2024 elections. We're going to hear their expertise as we get ever closer to the November election. I'll be with you at 5 o'clock Pacific. That's next Wednesday. Please support these programs with your tax-deductible contributions. It is an extraordinary labor of love by Janice, the work that Zev and Mel put in as well, and the people that help sponsor these nonprofit programs are done on all of our behalf. Please support it by going to the website JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org. That's JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org to make your contribution. Thank you so much for being with us, and have a very good evening.